Thanks so much for having me. Big thanks to the organizers, Rafa and Santi and Hannah and Gareth. And this is fun. I love talking methods. I love talking about meta-analysis. This is something I spend a lot of time thinking about, a lot of time working on, a lot of time talking about with other researchers. And to be honest, meta-analysis has and meta-analysis, and I use that term kind of like a blanket term, but to refer to a whole family of analyses and approaches. Meta-analysis is because it is sort of represents a family of analyses and a family of different secondary research techniques. It actually has I think this may sound overly dramatic, but it has actually changed my life. Sorry about some background noise here. It has actually changed my life, and it certainly changed my professional life in many ways. And it sort of changed the way that I look at all research, not just the secondary research that I engage in, not just the secondary research that I read and that I look at to inform my own work, my own thinking, but it's had a huge impact on me as a scholar and a person, and the way that I look at everything. So what you have here is, before I jump in, a couple of preliminary kind of comments. I have here a picture of the Grand Canyon, obviously, well, for those who are familiar with it, for a couple different reasons. One, because it's here where I live. It's just about an hour away, and so it's a big part of kind of the local culture here in where I live, which is a very small town called Flagstaff, Arizona. And because it's where I'm living, but also because the picture sort of has this kind of bird's eye view, and that's kind of a metaphor for what we get from meta-analysis. We get a kind of a view of an existing terrain or an existing domain of research that we simply can't get through any other lens. I also want to say that this is I sometimes teach this last semester during this spring 2022 semester. I teach a 15-week seminar on meta-analysis, and so we only have 2 hours. So this is going to be like we're gonna walk into the house, to the mansion of meta-analysis here for a couple of hours, okay? And we're gonna explore some parts of it. I want to take you throughout the whole house, but we're not necessarily going to open every drawer of every dresser and desk and look inside every closet. There's a lot to explore here, and there's a lot of different things that we could be looking at. We're not going to look at everything, but what I want to do is give you like this overview of both the conceptual and then some of the practical. And so we'll spend about the first half of the time talking purely conceptual, and then we'll get into a little bit more practical. Okay, some actual nuts and bolts and techniques, a little bit more hands-on kind of thing. Okay, so let's start off here at the broadest level, and I just want you all to think about for a minute what you do when you write a lit review, and I want you to maybe start off thinking about research synthesis and meta-analysis as a kind of as a type of review, which is what it is. And what's your process like? We've probably all written, lots of lit reviews, either lit reviews for a paper or lit reviews kind of for a class, like a synthesis paper we might write as a master's course assignment, things like that. Think about what your process is like. And I actually don't see the chat right now, but I wonder if there's a way to make that visible in case somebody wants to put things into the chat. Let's see here. Okay, okay, cool. So I'm also going to put into the chat. I don't know if everybody can see that, but that's a link to some materials that we're going to get into in a little bit. Okay. Okay. Cool. So, and then maybe think about also like what are the advantages or disadvantages to that type of approach, to that traditional kind of lit review approach, and then how this might differ from the meta-analytic process. Along the way, I would encourage you to think about a particular topic or domain in mind that you think you might be interested in meta-analyzing or synthesizing in some way, and that will, I think, help make some of the things that we talk about a little bit more concrete. So feel free to put it in the chat if you want, but I'll also just kind of talk through it. Okay, like so the process here. Yeah, and tell me if I'm wrong, but I think that a typical lit review would be something like, okay, I'm gonna do some library database searches, right? So let's say I want to look at the effect of X on Y or the correlation between A and B, whatever that might be. Let's just name a couple of variables just for fun. I don't know if anybody who's here does work in pronunciation, but let's just say we're interested in a meta-analysis of the correlation between intelligibility and accentedness. Okay, just to like put out a couple of variables that are fairly commonly analyzed in the L2 speech community. So accentedness and intelligibility. Okay, so we might do some searches on some databases like, I don't know if you guys used LLBA or EBSCO, Web of Science, Google Scholar. These are some of the things that we might commonly do. We might put in some searches like second language pronunciation, second language intelligibility, accentedness, and put in a bunch of keywords. And then what we're going to do, we're going to probably download some articles, right? That's what we do. And at some point, we'll probably stop downloading articles. We'll download like some, I don't know how many, that probably would vary across individuals. And then we're going to read them, and we're going to take some notes. Maybe we'll annotate the PDFs. Maybe we start putting them into groups or something like that. Like, oh, well, these all found this, and these all found this other thing, or maybe these operationalized accentedness or intelligibility in this way, and these kind of did that other way, or these found a correlation, these didn't find a correlation. Does this sound like more or less what most people you think might do when they do a review paper? Probably. And then eventually we have to write it up. So we start writing up those findings. Like, okay, well, maybe we categorize them according to the ones that did find a relationship, the ones that didn't find a relationship. Well, this is fairly typical, but this is also really highly problematic, and it's problematic in a number of different ways. We'll talk about those, but one of the main ways is that it's very non-systematic, and more specifically, it's very highly prone to bias on the part of the reviewer. So on the part of the person who's downloaded, because might it be that I, as the reviewer, am going to be more likely to download the articles that align with my own thinking, or maybe that align with the thinking of my advisor or the community in which I work. So we don't come into these projects always totally neutral. We're humans. We work in a particular context. Might it be that I'm more likely to include in my review studies that are published by people in the country where I work? Yeah, that might be the case. Or people that are I might have greater representation in certain countries more than others. Might it be that I then therefore also have greater representation of certain theoretical backgrounds or certain methodological approaches? Sure. And so what happens is when we do that kind of review, we're simply not getting a comprehensive view of the domain, which can be dangerous and can lead to the introduction of idiosyncrasies and certainly bias as well. Okay. And so when you think about the meta-analytic process, the process there is what we're trying to do is, and we'll get into this in just a second, is trying to convert, turn the process of reviewing a body of literature into a scientific process itself. And what does that look like? Well, what we're doing in meta-analysis, and this will apply to other types of synthesis, and I'll explain a little bit about different types of synthesis in a second. But what we're trying to do is develop, again, take the scientific enterprise that we apply and the same rigor, objectivity, transparency that we apply at the primary study level at the secondary level. And also going into this is an assumption that developing scientific knowledge is a cumulative and corporate enterprise. And when I say cumulative and corporate, I don't mean, when I say corporate, I'm not talking like IBM and Apple and stuff. What I mean is like we're a body. Like we're a body of scholars, all of us working together, and that we need to think of it more that way. Think of it more like we're all working together to advance knowledge, sort of, and think about each study as kind of just putting like one more pebble kind of on this mountain of knowledge. And same thing along with cumulative. So like it's all kind of building together. What we do, and this will come up in a few minutes as well, is we tend to just naturally, because we're so in the middle of each individual study that we're part of, that we tend to overemphasize individual studies and not put enough emphasis on sort of thinking at the synthetic or cumulative level. Let me just step out. Well, okay. So along with that, as I said a second ago, what we're trying to do is apply an empirical approach to reviewing findings in a given domain. That's kind of a definition of research synthesis. And by doing so, it allows us to, for our research, our secondary in this case research, to be systematic, more systematic, definitely more objective, and more transparent. And these are qualities I think that we always want in any of our research. We want to be systematic. We want to be more objective. I'm not saying that we as researchers are always purely objective. We're certainly not. But that we can introduce greater objectivity into our research through certain techniques, and then also more transparent. And what transparency gets us? What does it get us? Well, of course, it gets us a greater and enhanced ability for others to evaluate the decisions that we make along the way, and for others to then apply those decisions and to replicate or to change or redo some of the studies itself. But also builds confidence. It builds trust in each other's work. I don't know about you guys, but when I see a paper and I just feel like they kind of skipped through the methods without giving me like a really rich description of how they arrived at the data, how they prepared the data, how they analyzed it, what were their instruments, how they analyzed it, how they interpreted it. If they don't sort of go through that those procedures really, really clearly, I tend to have lots of questions and doubts consequently. So with these sort of broad ideas in mind, which are nothing revolutionary, this is simply just the way that we do research. Three key features of the meta-analytic approach, which distinguish it from a traditional qualitative approach to reviewing research, which is the way that we've all been writing lit reviews, most of us, our whole academic lives. First of all, so we apply systematicity, objectivity, transparency to the reviewing process. What we get is one of the ways that thinking or those principles manifest themselves is that we get more exhaustive searches. And so I mentioned, like, yeah, we might do some searches on the databases, we download some articles, and maybe we download enough articles until we feel like we have something to say. Well, that is going to be far from exhaustive. And like I said before, it's going to lead to greater selectivity, idiosyncrasy, potentially bias as well. And so what we're going to do in the meta-analytic approach, and we'll talk about this when we get to the different major stages in the sort of second half of the workshop, we're gonna try to conduct exhaustive searches as opposed to selective searches. What we're trying to do here at the search phase, and we'll get into this more concretely a little bit later, is for our sample of studies, and I want you to view in many ways parallels between primary research, where you might be looking at a sample of participants, a sample of language learners, a sample of texts for a corpus analysis. Okay, so that's your sample. Here in the meta-analytic approach, we want our sample to, if not equal, to approximate the population. So think about, I know this is like maybe a little bit abstract, but think about the probably hypothetical, but maybe also you could think of it as actually existing. A population of studies that all fit a particular set of criteria, or a population of studies that examine the effect of A on B or the correlation between X and Y. Okay, so think about a topic that you're interested in, and there are out there in the world right now available, or to varying degrees of accessibility. There is a population of studies that examine the relationship or relationships that you care about. Okay, so but what we're trying to do with the meta-analytic approach is we're trying to the extent possible, have the sample of studies that we acquire, obtain by whatever means, and we'll talk about that, to approximate the population. What does that get us? That gets us certainly greater generalizability. It gets us a much more comprehensive, again, that bird's eye view of the domain. And in doing so, it also greatly reduces the potential of bias that we all take into the studies that we carry out. Now that doesn't mean it eliminates it, because certainly our own biases can certainly come into play in the ways that we code those studies and analyze them and interpret them. But it helps us reduce bias, and we always want to reduce bias, don't we? And also, I mean, it just gives us something more concrete to say about the relationships that we care about. Second way that these sort of scientific principles manifest themselves in the context of meta-analysis is we're going to code really systematically for all the things that we think matter, for all the study features and all the effects. So again, thinking about your studies as your participants, as your cases in the analysis, we're going to code for everything. And so this might, this is maybe an extreme example, but the hand coding that a lot of us might do, or the sort of inserting of the annotations that we make sometimes when we're writing a lit review into a PDF might look something like this. And again, this is probably a little bit of an exaggeration, but this versus something like this. And this is actually the coding scheme for a recent meta-analysis by El-Abdali, looking at writing quality, L2 writing quality in single-authored versus collaboratively authored essays by learners, by language learners. Okay, and so what El-Abdali did was, certainly each study and sort of coming up with concrete and discrete study features that matter and that we think or that were motivated or believed to be associated with the study outcomes. In this case, the outcomes were the quality of the writing measured lots of different ways. Okay, and by the way, I'm not seeing the chat right now, so if anybody wants to jump in, that's totally fine by me to say something, or if anybody has anything to add along the way, that's totally cool. Okay, and then a third sort of key component is that of effect sizes. And probably everybody has heard of effect sizes, and maybe even sometimes different statistical indices that aren't necessarily referred to as effect sizes, but that are effect sizes. Effect sizes are the outcome variable in the meta-analysis at the primary study level, but then also at the secondary study level. And these are indices that are like, for example, the standardized mean difference, if people are familiar with that. That's oftentimes Cohen's D, or a correlation coefficient. That's an effect size index as well. And these are simply any index, though, that's that's a standardized measure of the strength of an effect or relationship is an effect size. Okay, and so the reason we use this is that we get information about the particular relationship or the effect that we care about across all studies, and then we're allowed, once we're using a standardized index or metric, because lots of different studies will use different tools and measures of the things that we all care about, right? Across different studies, we know individual studies are often very idiosyncratic. Then when we convert those results into a standardized index, then we're able to compare and combine results across studies. And so just, an example that comes to mind for those of you who might be familiar with the work on the CAF measures, complexity, accuracy, and fluency. Oh my gosh, how many dozens of different ways are there for measuring each of those different constructs? There's many. And so if we can convert the results onto a standardized metric, we're able to combine them via meta-analysis. These are going to be more precise. They're going to be often more stable, more intuitive, more informative than simply relying on p-values. When I was talking about that sort of fictitious example earlier about, okay, let's say I want to do a meta-analysis of the relationship between, what did I say, intelligibility and accentedness. And I said, okay, well, maybe I categorize them according to the studies that did or didn't find a correlation between them. That kind of thinking, that kind of binary thinking of there is a correlation or there's not a correlation, or there is an effect of A on B or of this particular treatment, or there is an effect, or whatever that happens to be. That kind of thinking is super limited and very common, but doesn't do our data justice. We have in the real world, of research, to whatever extent that is the real world, we have quantitative often measures of these constructs, these relationships, these phenomena that we care about, and these are not binary. These exist almost always in continuous space. And so it doesn't make sense for us to boil them down to or distill them into a simple yes-no dichotomy of relationship present or absent. What effect sizes do is they allow us to to quantify the extent of that relationship or the extent of that effect. This is just the formula in case anybody isn't familiar with a d-value. D-value is very, very simple. It's simply the mean of one group that could be of participants, of L2 learners, L2 users, of mean frequency of a particular linguistic feature in texts, minus the mean of another group divided by their combined or their pooled standard deviation. And what this gets us, as you can see from the formula, is it gets us the difference between the groups expressed in the standard deviation units. So you can kind of think of it like a z-score, right? Because when we say that there's a d-value of 1 between two groups of text or participants or whatever, then we're talking about one. Same would be the same thing as a z-score of 1 between the two groups. Okay, so 1 standard deviation difference. And we'll get and that too we'll get into a little bit later, and I'll give you guys tools for calculating those this particular index. Also, just as a sort of introductory comment, mention if anybody's interested in, I have in the Google Drive folder a bunch of materials, and among those materials I put some readings, some sort of introductory readings. One of them, if anybody's coming from a corpus linguistics background, you might want to check out this one. This is Mizumoto et al. That just came out in one of the handbooks, wonderful handbooks of corpus linguistics that just came out in 2021. I think that was edited by Magali Picot and Stefan Gries. And then if anybody's interested in a more general introduction to meta-analysis, as well as some discussion of some current and future directions of meta-analysis and applied linguistics, this is a paper that's just about to come out. I actually don't know if I put that in the folder because it's still not published, but I'm happy to share it if anybody wants it. Okay. So now, thanks to these and many other benefits of meta-analysis, we can see massive growth, that this is sort of just taken off across many of the sciences, not just in the social sciences. This is the growth of research synthesis and meta-analysis across different fields: ecology, economics, all fields, in medicine. In medical research, it's my understanding that it's sort of you couldn't publish a non-meta-analytic or at least non-synthetic review unless in any of their major journals. In the broader language sciences, this is just a kind of a quick proxy. In the broader language sciences, though, this is searching for the word meta-analysis. We can see a massive growth in using the LLVA, the Linguistics and Language Behavior Abstracts database, the library. And then in applied linguistics, certainly we've had just an explosion of meta-analytic and research synthetic techniques over the last approximately 20 years. And these are basically the number of kind of items in. Let me back out of here for a second. Right, so I maintain on my website this bibliography of all the synthetic and meta-analytic work in applied linguistics, and that is what this is based on. And there's probably, I don't know, a couple hundred, 300 or 400 now hits or references, and that's what this. So you can see it's really kind of blowing up. And I would say for good reason. The one thing though I want to sort of caution about a little bit is that it can kind of we have to get this right. It's important that we get it right. It's of course important that we get all research right. I care very, very deeply about the quality of research methods in applied linguistics, and that's what I spend most of my time on. Actually, is trying to advance a methodological agenda, trying to improve research methods in applied linguistics. One of those areas happens to be meta-analysis, but I feel like in some ways the stakes are a little bit higher in meta-analytic research, and the reason is that meta-analytic research tends to be more highly cited, a little bit higher impact, more visible than other types of research, than other types of sort of typical research. This is actually a paper from now almost 17 years ago or so. This is in the realm of health sciences, and they were looking at citations within the first 2 years of publication of different types of studies. So meta-analysis, RCTs, cohort studies, case studies, things like that. And they found that the ones that were most highly cited were actually the meta-analyses. And so this just, to me, is sort of a proxy for impact. And to me, what this says is, this is not a, by the way, this is not a call for, oh, we should do meta-analysis because it's high impact, it gets cited. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is we have to get it right, because if they are going to be more highly cited, then that means they are potentially having a higher impact, and so they have to be good. They have to be. We have to minimize threats to validity. Okay, so really quick, what areas of applied linguistics have been synthesized and meta-analyzed? Is anybody aware of any areas in the field that have been synthesized or meta-analyzed? You guys could type them into the chat if you felt like it. Bilingual advantage. Yeah. Okay, good. That's right. There's been actually a bunch of meta-analyses on the bilingual advantage, implicit versus explicit instruction, teaching. Exactly. That's right. That's good. There's been a few there as well. Oh my gosh, yes. A ton of meta-analyses on corrective feedback. According to my last count, if somebody was to go to that bibliography that I maintain on my website, I bet you'd find 30 meta-analyses of feedback. Kind of crazy. That topic has been really, really heavily meta-analyzed. Good. So I just want to give, in case anybody doesn't come in with much background or familiarity with what's been done or addressed at the meta-analytic level, just kind of a quick survey, I guess, of what's out there. And then, but also to set that up first, a quick kind of taxonomy. So to set us up, we have, it's all, okay, so all literature reviews and secondary research. This is what we were sort of describing earlier, the traditional non-systematic approach to synthesis. And then we're going to live over here, over in the systematic world. That's the discussion for today. Now, there is qualitative research synthesis, and then, but for the most part, what we're talking about here is quantitative research synthesis. Within that, if we're going to go one level lower in this sort of branching tree, we get different types of quantitative systematic synthesis. Okay, and so these include historical syntheses, theoretical syntheses, scoping reviews, rapid reviews, which has not actually been done so far, a type of synthesis called reliability generalization meta-analysis, methodological synthesis, which is a type of synthesis that I've been involved in a lot in recent years, and then research synthesis and meta-analysis. And let me talk about just for a second. I know this sounds like a lot of new terminology, and they each have different types of goals or aims, choices that the researcher needs to make along the way. All of them, though, share the common features of systematicity and exhaustiveness and a quantitative nature. Okay, the main thing, though, since we're going to focus on meta-analysis, the main thing that distinguishes meta-analysis from these other types of reviews is simply the aggregation of effect sizes. Okay, so you can apply all the same principles and all the same techniques to other types of reviews, and that would be perfectly appropriate and fitting. But once, if and when there is an aggregation, and by aggregation I just mean averaging, if and when there's an averaging of effect sizes, that's when technically we're talking about meta-analysis. Okay, but I'm going to mostly use the word meta-analysis throughout this, even though you may not, a particular synthesis may not be meta-analytic in nature. All right. Okay, so just kind of like the really, really fast whirlwind tour of what's been done, I've just sort of categorized them sort of loosely. This is not like an official categorization, but we've seen lots and lots of meta-analyses in the realm of instructed SLA, ISLA, instructed second language acquisition. These are all looking at different areas of instructed SLA, lots in the area of pronunciation instruction, grammar instruction, vocab instruction, pragmatics instruction, reading, another popular topic. And I mentioned this also just for those of you who are coming from different areas, and I know that I think probably everybody's coming from lots of different areas. Actually, I would love it if people would just kind of throw into the chat bar what is, or maybe like a couple of topics or a couple of areas that you're interested in that you're working on, just so I can try and make this as relevant to you as possible. Like if you're into, I'm just thinking of my colleague Jesse, if you're into register analysis, or if you're into pronunciation, L2 speech analysis, or whatever that might be, I'd love to hear about it. If you guys want to put those into the chat. Yeah, so lots in the realm of reading. Let me go through here. Lots of meta-analyses in vocabulary research. Lots of meta-analyses on strategy instruction. Oh my gosh, like we said before, feedback, interaction, bilingual education, benefits of bilingualism, like we saw before mentioned, the bilingual advantage, number of different meta-analyses there. A whole lot of meta-analyses looking at technology and call, the effects of call, computer-mediated communication, language assessment. That's actually an area where I'd like to see a little bit more attention at the meta-analytic level. It's such a rich, mature, well-developed, very quantitative domain of the field. I think that we are probably, that it's an area that I would say is probably fairly ripe for more attention at the meta-analytic level. A little bit of attention in corpus linguistics, also an area where we need a little bit more meta-analytic attention. There's so many questions that have been, like, there's so many, anytime there's been a question addressed across multiple studies, it is potentially ready for meta-analysis. Study abroad, TBLT, no representation, universal grammar, textual enhancement, foreign and national student achievement, listening, phonological awareness, order of acquisition, practice effects, and then sort of other methodological practices, conceptual meta methods. And then this is sort of a, I mentioned earlier methodological synthesis as one of the different types of synthetic research. These are different types of domains that have been subject to methodological synthesis. And methodological synthesis is where we take the principles of meta-analysis or research synthesis and we apply them to understanding the methods in a given domain, usually not simply as a means to evaluate or criticize, but to take that information and say, okay, here's how we're using this particular technique, or here's the extent to which the methods in this particular area are of quality, and here's how we can improve them in future research. You can see just some of the, and then these have been focused on individual research techniques that have been studied at the synthetic level. Okay, cool. I'm gonna go back into full screen here. Okay, so a little bit more, before we get to the practical part, a little bit more on the conceptual level. I know we've been sort of living in the conceptual here. We'll get to the practical soon. But I want to talk about a couple of sort of three key concepts that we have to sort of have a clear understanding of in order to appropriately conduct synthetic research. So the first one I mentioned before already, effect sizes. I want to talk a little bit more about that. This is sometimes a way that we get at what people refer to as practical significance. And we talk about practical significance oftentimes in contrast with statistical significance. Because statistical significance is very, very present in those of us who work in quantitative domains. And it sounds like from those areas that you guys mentioned as the topics that you're interested in, it sounds, leaning probably more quanti, as I saw somebody say the other day, more numbery than quality, more quantity. So anyway, right, we already defined it. Now, as sort of quantitative, standardized estimate of the strength of a relationship or of an effect. And can anybody think of any common effect sizes? We mentioned a couple before, but the two main ones would be Cohen's D. The two most common ones that we see in applied linguistics are Cohen's D and then just the correlation coefficient, which is a standardized index as well. Okay, and so we have this formula, mean of 1 minus mean of 2. So again, that could be participants. You could talk about L1 speakers and L2 or LX speakers divided by their shared or their pooled standard deviation, okay, or experimental group, control group, something like that. text type 1, text type 2, register 1, register 2, for whatever kind of area that you're working in. And that's not something that you have to do by hand at all, though. So in the folder, the Google Drive folder, there's a couple of different Excel macros that will calculate effect sizes calculate D values for you. Of course, there's loads of our packages that'll do it. There's a website that I like a lot by a guy named Atsushi Mizumoto, a good friend and collaborator of mine. You can do it there. Anyway, there's lots of different ways. I think if for people that use SPSS, I think SPSS now will produce a D value. I know for sure JASP does, if you like JASP. Anyway, basically any stats package will do it for you. And we kind of already answered this question, but the reason we can't use the raw data, such as the mean difference, just the difference between the groups, is that we're talking again, different studies will operationalize their measures very, very differently. Like, remember we said the many, many different measures of complexity, or the many, think about if you're doing research on measures of teacher efficacy, which somebody mentioned, or measures of vocabulary knowledge. There's just so many different ways of measuring it. And so we have to come up with a standardized index, because that's what allows us to average those effect sizes together through meta-analysis. And I'm not really going to talk too much about this, although much has and could be said about the relative merits of effect sizes or practical significance versus p-values. I'm personally not a really big fan of null hypothesis significance testing and p-values. Why? Because NHST and p-values I find to be very, very unreliable. They vary as a function of sample size. So as I'm sure many of you know, any mean difference between groups will be statistically significant if you have a large enough sample size. Okay, and so then to some extent, whether or not you have statistical significance is simply a question of, did it have a large enough sample to detect that difference between the groups? Because the groups are always going to be different. It's never that we take measures of two different groups of individuals or texts or whatever and find that they're exactly identical. And so to me, it really doesn't. We're talking about a very unstable index if we're relying on statistical significance to tell us about the presence or absence of an effect. Second, p-values and NHST is uninformative in that it forces us, as I was saying before, forces us to take our continuous sort of this continuous space or measure of something, the results that are not binary, and forces us to turn them into a yes/no dichotomy, which I think is such a loss of data. It's kind of sad, I actually think, to take all your results, take all your data, and to boil that down to a simple yes/no when we're all working in a more continuous environment. Effect sizes, by contrast, will express the magnitude, the actual size of the relationship in question. And by the way, isn't this what we really want to know? Isn't it that we actually want to know not about the presence or absence of an effect or relationship or difference? We actually want to know if we're actually going to I think, inform theory and inform practice in whatever you're interested in. We actually want to know to what extent there actually is a difference, or to what extent there is a relationship between or among the variables. And then third, I have little interest in p-values and null hypothesis significance testing more generally, because it's arbitrary. I mean, think about the first, remember like back to the first stats class you took once upon a time, and you learned about the 0.05 cutoff or convention. Didn't you think to yourself, like, hey, like, what's up with 0.05? Like, why is it 0.05? Why isn't it 0.1? Or why isn't it 0.01? Or why isn't it 0.15? Like it's just a made up number. There's nothing magical about 0.05. But this is the thing that we use to live and die by. I mean, this is just absurd. This is totally it's arbitrary. And I don't think as researchers, as scholars, very hardworking people, we owe it to ourselves to be a little bit more thoughtful about our data than to simply adhere to some sort of arbitrary convention. Okay, so yeah, I know that this isn't maybe a super mainstream view, but I have little interest or time in p-values. I think really where it's at is looking at effect sizes pretty much always. Just to make this a little bit more concrete, I wanted to give you a couple of examples of effect sizes, what we get. And so what you have here, this is actually the each of these kind of rows, and the word for this type of plot, if anybody has seen one before, this is called a forest plot, but it's nothing fancy or special. This is simply a plot of each of these little bars represents the mean difference with the confidence interval around that mean difference for each individual study in this particular sample. Okay, so again, this is from a meta-analysis on the quality of individual versus collaborative writing. Okay, so each of these primary studies had a group of participants that wrote essays that were written individually, and then a group of participants that wrote essays written collaboratively. And then all those essays got scored, and using whatever indices they were using, in this case, rubric scores. And each of the bars represents the advantage, in this case, the higher scores that were given to the fact that each of these studies found higher scores given to the essays that were written collaboratively. Okay, and so in this case, this one over here, this is like really pretty strong effect. This Sagman found that there was a difference of almost 2 standard deviations for the participants that wrote collaborative texts versus the individual writing texts. Okay, and so this one here, still fairly large. We're talking about a 1.5 standard deviation difference on average for the participants that wrote their essays collaboratively versus individually. This one much smaller, but still an advantage for the group that wrote collaboratively over individually. Okay, just to kind of give you an idea. And then in the meta-analysis, what we would do is take all of these effects. So each of these d values, each of these is a d value, and this is the scale here on the x-axis is our d values, and we would average them together. Okay, so I mean that's really at its core, that's all we're doing here. There's a lot more to it, but I don't want to set this up as something that's very complex, because it doesn't really have to be that way at all. It can be very straightforward. We're simply collecting the d values or the correlation coefficients, or for those of you who work in a corpus background, something like normed frequency, that could be thought of as an effect size as well. MI scores or something like that. I don't know if people still use MI scores. I'm sort of out of the loop on that stuff. But whatever the standardized index is for your particular area, if you can extract that index across multiple studies, you can meta-analyze it. Okay, that makes it an effect size, and it can be meta-analyzed. And so averaging these together, we get a d-value of 0.94, meaning that on average we get about a difference of 1 standard deviation for the essays written collaboratively over individually. To take this up, one more example here. This is an example of a meta-analysis that I was involved in very recently. I think it's coming out in the very next issue of Studies in Second Language Acquisition, SSLA. And each of these is another forest plot. This is a little bit more data intensive, this forest plot. When we get here, each of these bars represents the correlation between, we were looking at, I don't know if anybody is familiar with elicited imitation tasks. It's sort of a kind of a shortcut proficiency tool. The correlation between elicited imitation tasks and other measures of proficiency. So essentially we were looking at the criterion related validity, if you guys are familiar with that term. Looking at the criterion related validity of elicited imitation tasks. And each of these represents the magnitude of that correlation between an elicited imitation task and another measure of proficiency. Okay, and so we can see that they range fairly widely. This is another example of a forest plot, which is a really nice tool that we use often in meta-analysis for visualizing our data. So just to give you an idea of what the meta-analytic data look like, okay, before we get further. And effect size. Each of these represents the meta-analytic effect of one individual study in the sample. All right, and so we can see here the overall meta-analytic effect was a correlation of 0.67. And the correlation of 0.67 is actually pretty strong, just in case anybody isn't used to looking at correlation indices. Okay, so what about what's like typical in applied linguistics? An idea? Well, it actually ranges hugely. Each of these bars here represents, just as we're talking about effect sizes, I just want to give you guys a few more examples of like what this looks like. Um, each of these bars actually represents an effect size from a different meta-analysis of instructed second language acquisition. Okay, so we see, and I've organized these according to different skill areas within SLA. So grammar, vocabulary, pragmatics, and pronunciation. And there's actually more here, but I didn't want to fit any more here in the figure. But we can see that the effect sizes actually vary fairly widely across the meta-analyses of grammar instruction. There's some variability here across meta-analyses of vocabulary instruction. Also, substantial variability here in meta-analyses of pragmatics instruction, and less so in the realm of pronunciation instruction. But these are all D values, again, standardized mean differences of different meta-analyses of instructed SLA. And then one more, excuse me, looking at the overall correlation of different learner internal or psychological variables and L2 proficiency or achievement. Each of these bars represents a meta-analytic correlation between a different individual difference variable or psychological learner internal kind of variables like motivation, anxiety, aptitude, and L2 proficiency or achievement. Okay, and so again, these are correlations. Excuse me. And just kind of for fun, I think it's interesting to point out that typically we see correlations of around 0.25 in the realm of individual differences as correlated with L2 achievement or proficiency. Okay, the second bit, so key concept number one, effect sizes, a quantitative approach, and the quantitative index we get as our outcome variable for meta-analysis. Key concept number two is actually choice, and I kind of want to push back in this brief discussion on the idea that meta-analysis is somehow objective and pure. It certainly is more objective than other types of reviews, but we have to be aware of this just to sort of check our bias. Okay, and so sometimes you see I have seen a bunch recently. Like meta-analyses, excuse me, that treat it as kind of a recipe. Like, okay, let's get together a bunch of primary studies on this topic. We'll get a couple of RAs to do a bunch of coding for us, and we just sort of combine it until smooth. We get a D value that comes out. The cookies might look good, but this is not what we want. Okay, we want. There's certainly, I don't know if I would totally agree that it is much an art as it is a science, but there's certainly a lot of decision making and choices that go into it, and I just think it's so important that we as scholars in applied linguistics and the language sciences that care about if we as a field want to have meta-analysis be part of our methodological repertoire. Just like any type of analysis or any type of research technique, we have to be able to evaluate the choices along the way. There are lots and lots of choices and decisions. You guys know that as researchers yourselves, doing a study involves tons and tons of choices and decision making. That's no different in the case of meta-analysis. The meta-analyst is making tons of choices along the way as well. These choices have to be justified, have to be explained. It's not like there is necessarily always a right or objective path to take in every instance. And so we just have to be aware of that along the way. And these are the four, as we'll look at in the second half of the workshop today, the four major stages of conducting a meta-analysis, which run parallel to primary research. Each of these contains tons and tons of decisions, and we'll talk through some of those decisions in a few minutes. And this is just to give an example of just how the choices that we make can affect the results so much. And so each of these bars represents meta-analyses of the effectiveness of computer-assisted language learning. And we see just based on the fact that they vary so much, that there are choices that go into these. Each of these meta-analyses that are highlighted here in these boxes represents the effectiveness of call glosses. Okay, and you can see just how much they vary. And so it's impossible. And I show this just to illustrate just how much the influence of choice and decision making on the part of the meta-analyst, how strong that is. Okay, so key concept number 3. So key concept number 1, effect size is a quantitative approach to synthesizing previous research. Key concept at the conceptual level number 2 is choice and decision making, hugely important, of course, at the primary level, also at the secondary synthetic meta-analytic level. Key concept number 3 is probably the most conceptual of all of these, and this is synthetic mindedness, which sounds maybe very lofty, very abstract. What do I mean by that? Synthetic mindedness, this is a kind of a different way of thinking about research in general. I mentioned earlier on, like at the very beginning, I was like, meta-analysis changed my life, which is true. I know that sounds kind of cheesy, but it is also true. But meta-analysis also certainly changed the way that I think about all research. As Schmidt put it in the early 90s, and Schmidt was one of the sort of initial sort of founders or inventors of meta-analysis from the late 70s, when meta-analysis was sort of born out of the need to come up with ways to synthesize research systematically, because there was enough research that had accumulated across different fields in education and psychology in particular, that they needed to come up with a way to aggregate findings across studies. Anyway, Schmidt, working with a guy named Hunter, Schmidt and Hunter, said, meta-analysis represents major changes in the way psychologists, also language science researchers, view the general research process. This is not just about the way that we think about secondary research. It also has to do with primary research. And along with that, I would add that it requires, taking on a synthetic approach requires that we stop thinking about, stop overemphasizing individual study effects and start thinking and recognizing the fact that no single study can provide a conclusive answer to any question that's worth answering. Now, I'll say that again. No single study can provide a conclusive answer to any question. We have research questions that we need to answer, that we want to answer, that we need to, that help us advance knowledge in our field. A single study will never do that. And until we recognize that, we're always going to be overemphasizing the results of individual studies. We have to think synthetically, of course, when we conduct secondary reviews and secondary research like meta-analysis, but also even in the way that we think about and frame and analyze and interpret and report at the primary level. Okay, this manifests itself, the synthetic movement in a lot of different ways, and a few different ways that it does would be in the resurgence of replication research. Replication research is certainly, to me, part of this broader movement of recognizing that there's no single study idea. And there's just a few bits of evidence of the surge and the move towards replication research. A greater interest in practical significance and effect sizes. Lots of different journals now in our field require these, but these also help us to move beyond overemphasizing individual studies and thinking more about standardized indices that can be compared or combined across studies. The use of methodological synthesis, which has been really widespread in recent years. Improvements in data reporting. Data reporting to me is also part of a synthetic movement, in that it helps us see data or patterns or trends across individual studies, and interpret results beyond an individual study. Open science practices, things like open data, open instruments, study pre-registration, sharing our code with other researchers, and of course, meta-analysis, part of this synthetic movement. So, almost done with the practical. And then this is, we're not really going to answer these questions here right now, but I just want you to think about for a second what this means. What does it mean? What is engaging with or embracing a synthetic mindset or synthetic ethic, as Norris and Ortega called it in a wonderful 2006 chapter? If I haven't put that chapter in the folder of readings, I will do that and make a note after the workshop, in case anybody wants to download it. It's an excellent introduction to some of the conceptual thinking of meta-analysis and research synthesis. But I just wanted you to consider for a second, what does this synthetic mindset or ethic mean for the ways that we design studies, the ways that we choose topics? What does it mean for editors and reviewers and the way that they consider existing research, the way that we write up lit reviews, analyses, the way that we report? Are we producing little islands in search of continents? What do I mean by that? Like, just are we just sort of acting like, are we islands in search of continents, or just like, little individual towers that don't actually connect to a broader understanding? This is inefficient. This is inefficient, and I might even argue unethical at the field-wide level, that we don't think and act synthetically. Of course, part of the responsibility rests on editors and reviewers to impose upon authors to think and act more synthetically in their research. This also has implications for those of us who are teacher trainers or instructors of applied linguistics content knowledge. Certainly for those of us who engage in researcher training, which is something that I do a lot of, and then also for practitioner audiences. I think that just one example would be that we could and maybe should more often, when we're doing researcher training, or when we're doing teacher training, for example, or when we're doing, if anybody here does teacher workshops, let's say for language teachers, that rather than assigning individual studies for the teachers or our students to read, that we should probably bring in some of the meta-analytic literature, because it's going to give us a much more stable, much more comprehensive, less biased view of the different topics and relationships that we care about. Do we behave this way? Why and why not? I don't know. Mostly not. But I think we're moving in the right direction. I think we're certainly moving in the right direction towards more synthetic thinking in the ways that we do research, the way that we interpret it, the ways that we use it in practical and applied contexts. That's a bigger question we can't really get to right now. Okay, that's kind of the end of the very, very conceptual and practical, the very conceptual part of the workshop. So I will stop there just for 1 second, and we'll now move on to the more practical, where we talk through the 4 major stages of meta-analysis.